Aaron, if you would just let me know when we can start, that would be great.
Yeah, Rob, I think we're good.
We got everybody on? Terrific. Well, let me welcome everyone this afternoon to one in a series of presentations that we're putting on with our colleagues at Intillis and Source One. My name is Rob Remington, and I am one of the leaders of the construction practice group here at Hahn Lozier and Parks. And I'm pleased to also be presenting today with my partner, Aaron Evanchek, one of our other leaders in our construction practice group, and Jeff Rausch, one of our colleagues in our construction services group. Aaron, you can go ahead and advance the slides, and I'll apologize to those of you online because Aaron's going to be advancing our slides today, so you're going to hear a lot of us requesting Aaron to advance our slides. One of the things that makes our group somewhat unique is we have a group of non-lawyer industry professionals, and Jeff Rausch is our director of that group, that work closely with our construction lawyers and bring years and years of construction project and complex project experience to our team. And we're pleased to have Jeff speak with us today. Also want to just kind of let you know that we have a blog that we have had for a number of years now, constructionlawinsights.com. We keep a pretty intense use of this to try to update our clients and our contacts with what's happening in the construction industry trends. Obviously, right now it's heavily laden with COVID-19 related information, but it's all there for you to look at and see, and we'd encourage you to sign up and to visit it from time to time. We've found that it's an excellent resource. Aaron, you can go ahead and advance slides for me. So we're going to talk about basically 5 things this afternoon, and we're going to pack it into an hour, so we're going to move relatively quickly. I've asked Aaron Hawk, since there's only, I think, about 10 or so people online with us, to go ahead and unmute all of you. You should keep yourselves on mute to avoid background. But if you have a question, this is all about really answering your questions and hitting on things that are important to you and your business. So I would encourage you, to just interrupt us, ask questions. We're happy to answer those questions. And if it's something we can't answer immediately for you, we're happy to have a dialogue with you offline. I want to also thank, although I know Suhas Shah, the founder of Intillis, is online with us, and we're doing this with his organization. I want to thank them and again our colleagues at Source One for partnering up with us to offer this presentation. It's been a great experience working with them. So we're going to talk about navigating some of the unknown impacts of COVID-19. That's really what I'm going to focus on. I'm going to have to then jump off, and I'm going to let Aaron Evanchek and Jeff Rausch round things out for the last part of the program, talking about notices under your contract to make sure that you're locking down and prosecuting your claims without waiving or voiding or losing any rights, understanding excusable and compensable delays, particularly in this environment of COVID-19, and then specifically ways to track and document delays. And then finally, we'll finish it out with just general discussion on prosecution of claims, both up and downstream. With respect to item 4, one of the things that we've done, and you can leave that slide right there, and that's perfect, is our construction services group, Jeff Rausch and his colleague Chad Van Arnhem, have created what we call our COVID-19 claims checklist. It's a one-page list of practices to follow when documenting any potential claims, particularly related to COVID-19, although, as I've said to Jeff and Chad, it really is a nice checklist generally. And frankly, I think this presentation, although very focused on COVID-19, actually many of the practices we're talking about, most of the things we're talking about, are practices that you really should be and should implement, and you should consider carrying over as the pandemic hopefully starts to die down and things get back to normal. That checklist we are happy to make available to you, and all you need to do is email Jeff Rausch or me or Aaron or Suhas for that matter. We'll make sure that we get you a copy of that. We've gotten very good feedback. Our clients have found it to be very useful. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the situation right now, and we're kind of now 3 months into it, so a lot of the things that I'm talking about, frankly, are things that you probably have already considered to implement or are implementing or have decided not to implement. But I think it's worth talking about some of these issues for reassurance for many of you, but also because I think they are practices that you really need to and should be considering to carry over into your regular life in the construction industry. But the reality for all of this is that there just isn't a one-size-fits-all for any of the things that we're talking about. There are some things that are in your control, and that's what Aaron and Jeff and I want to talk about today. What can you do that's in your control to hopefully lessen the impact of what's going on and protect your rights? And then there's a lot of things that obviously are out of your control, out of all of our control, and that's where we're kind of all back, I guess taking the ride together, working our ways through it. But we're going to focus on what's in your control and what you can anticipate and should be thinking about even now, 3 months into this, and as hopefully things start to open back up. Aaron, you can go ahead and advance the next slide. So what we've been saying to people, and this continues to be the case, is plan for the worst and hope for the best, or hopefully at least better. Most of the major construction digests, publications, have generally pointed to a major downturn in our industry. And I've highlighted a couple. These aren't that old. Both of these are under, I think, 3 weeks old. And again, right now at least, it's looking like we need to plan for it to be in the long haul. I was talking to a client today, in-house counsel at a significant contractor, a major contractor out of New York. They're starting to feel like maybe things are going to pick up quickly. But I think we're all kind of waiting to see. So I think the best advice is to plan for the worst, be ready for the worst, and hopefully you'll be much better off because it won't be that bad or as bad. Go ahead, Aaron, you can advance to the next slide. So I want to talk about basically these items, and then I'm going to turn this over to Aaron Evanchek and Jeff Roush. But I want to talk about sort of the immediate cash flow to your business and some of the things that you should be thinking about and implementing if you haven't already done that. I want to talk about dealing with issues of potential shortages in reliable labor, supply chain problems. I want to talk about something that we don't focus on in good times, and that is project cancellation. What are your rights? What can you do? What should you be thinking about in the event that projects are either delayed, suspended, or canceled? And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about liability, not from a impact or delay claim perspective, but what happens and what are the potential risks with respect to infected workers on your project. So that's what I'm going to cover this morning. Aaron, you can go ahead and advance to the next slide. So immediate cash flow. Couple things that may seem like they're common sense, but you should be focusing on right now. And I'm going to skip to the bottom two, and then I'll come back up to the top two bullet points. Aggressive collections. Put an emphasis, put a committee together, put somebody on what can we be doing to be more aggressive with respect to making sure we're getting paid and we're getting paid on time. What should we be doing and can we be doing with respect to aged receivables? Money that we haven't pursued, that we have the right to pursue and we should be pursuing. Put a plan in place to do a better job at pursuing those receivables. Extended payables, conserve cash. What should I have in place? What are my policies with respect to my payables? Do I have contracts with pay if paid provisions where I'm paying when I don't need to be paying and I can actually conserve some cash? What other things can I be doing to make sure that I can conserve cash right now in the situation we're in? The other things I want to talk about, though, are some of the lending opportunities that you have. And a week from today at 1 o'clock p.m., Suhas Shah is going to be talking with one of our partners, Ivan Golden, on the Main Street Lending Program, which is another lending program that is coming out. And I would encourage those of you who are continuing to evaluate the cash flow impacts on their business and what their opportunities might be to sign up and chime in and listen to Suhas and Ivan talk about the Main Street Lending Program, you know, one of the important things about that program, and Suhas will unmute and tell me I'm wrong if I am, but is that is not, you're not excluded just because you got a loan under the payroll protection plan from seeking additional funds under the Main Street Lending Program. Those funds, as I understand it, are not forgivable, but it is an opportunity, again, to manage your cash going forward, particularly in the unknown circumstances we're in. The stimulus loan, many of you may have received a stimulus loan. What are you doing to maximize your forgiveness options with respect to that? If you haven't been evaluating it carefully, you should be, and there are lots of materials. You can go to our blog, you can go to the people at Untitled who have focused on and really become specialists in how to maximize forgiveness if you've gotten a stimulus loan, to make sure that as much of the cash that was loaned to you will be forgiven. So things to be thinking about right now in today's environment. How do I protect my company going forward? You know, we're just reminding clients to get down to the basics. Again, these are points that you should be focusing on anyways, but in today's times, having an enhanced focus and view and plan with respect to these issues is key. How do we make money in this business? We make money by making progress on projects. Focus on making progress everywhere you possibly can. Create those receivables. Enhance tracking those receivables. Make sure that your pay applications are right. If you're having issues with respect to those things, put a plan in place to make sure that you've got all the right information in them, they're correct when they go out, you've got the lien waivers that you need, you've got the releases you need, and that there's not going to be any delay in getting paid on that project. Pursue early release of retention. What does your contract say? Do you have the right to release a retention after 50%? Do you have the right to release depending upon your schedule of values? Should you be pursuing that if you're not? If you aren't, be aggressive. Pursue early release of retention where you have the ability to do that. I talked a little bit about pay if paid provisions, downstream receivables. If you have the right, keeping in mind your obligations under the Prompt Pay Act, but if you have the right to withhold funds and you're in a situation where, you know, things are volatile, now is the time to make sure that you're evaluating those rights and that you're enforcing those rights where you need to. A topic that I know Jeff Roush could talk on all day long if we let him is just the issue of scope creep. You know, how many times have you been on, or your project managers on projects where the scope is creeping and you're not doing anything to recover the funds that you would be entitled to? I mean, one of the things that we talk about with our clients all the time is the unique aspect of construction contracts, and it is called the ability to change it up. The owner has the ability to add work. The owner has the ability to subtract work. Very unusual for a general agreement. But that's the way construction works. And if scope is being added, if there are unforeseen conditions, if there are issues, if there are changes in the way that you are going to approach the project, you were supposed to mobilize on the south end, they said you got to mobilize on the north end. That's going to change things up for whatever reason. How is that impacting you? And if it is impacting you, evaluate it and then seek compensation for it. And those are practices that you really should be getting yourselves into and focusing on going forward, because you would be amazed at the amount of lost revenue that you'll see once you start implementing practices to make sure that you're being compensated fairly for everything that you're doing on a project or for legitimate changes on a project. Okay, Aaron, you can go to the next slide. So reliable labor and supply chain, critical in today's environment. It's always critical in our business, but it's especially critical in today's environment. You may be used to, hey, I got the same suppliers, I use them all the time, that's great. But you know, the reality in today's environment, and I think it's important to emphasize, we may be 3 months into this, but companies are just starting to feel the impact. So to let your foot off the gas or say, you know something, I've been down this road, I'm good, not a good idea. The reality is some companies are better prepared to deal with supply chain issues, some aren't. You want to know which ones are and which ones aren't, and you want to know where you're vulnerable because, you know, you may find out and you find out too late when you could have acted early. And you'll hear one of the things that I'm going to say towards the end here is You want to preempt these issues. That's the whole idea. Don't just say, no, I'm okay. Look at it. Take it seriously. Talk to your suppliers. How are you doing? Have you had any issues? Ask the questions. Demand, you'll see in my bullet here in my third bullet, demand visibility. Say, I really want to see where are you at with your inventory? Where are you at with your production schedules? How are you doing with respect to PO fulfillment and shipment status? And am I a priority? Am I going to be assured that I'm going to get what I need when I need it? And if I'm not, then you need to be identifying and thinking about alternative plans for key vulnerable suppliers. And again, these are practices, frankly, and these are evaluations and reviews that you should be doing anyway. They're healthy. Is this the best supplier? Are there other suppliers? What would my plan B be? What should I be thinking about? And the same goes to my second bullet point, your workforce and your labor plan. If you don't have it, think about it right now. What would I do if this happened on a project? One of the things that Aaron and I were just talking about a matter earlier today, and one of the things that we do is say, well, if we're in the other side's position, what would we be thinking about? What would we be doing? What are they thinking about right now? Because that helps us frame our strategy and our thinking with respect to where we are in our situation for our client. It's no different when we talk about any of these issues, putting a plan in place. What would I do if this contractor fails? If this supplier can't get me get me the materials? What would happen? And you should have somebody thinking about those things now and into the future, even as things improve. Aaron, go ahead. You can go to the next slide. So I told you I'd say this: predict and preempt these issues. Don't blow it off. Implement and immediately investigate slowdowns. Anytime you get a feeling like, there might be an issue, why am I feeling like there might, I should check this out, check it out. Look into it. Make sure you don't have an issue that you're maybe turning your head to, or you're thinking, they'll deal with it. It'll be okay. Don't leave your fate in somebody else's hands, ever. I always say to our lawyers, don't put yourself in a position where you are basically carrying over somebody else's mistakes. You take control of your destiny, and you make sure that you're implementing your best practices and your best thinking, and you will be fine. And the same goes for everyone in this business as far as I'm concerned. Aaron, you can go to the next slide. Project cancellation. I mentioned this at the beginning. Think about what your backlog is right now, the projects you're working on. Are there any where you're unfamiliar with the owners, you haven't worked with them before? There's potential for vulnerability. It is okay, and in fact, in many of your contracts, you'll see that you have the right to demand something called adequate assurance. I want to know that you can pay me for the work I'm doing, whether you're working for an upstream contractor or whether you're working directly for an owner. If you have concerns and you want to be sure that there's an issue, there isn't going to be an issue, where you're at a burn rate of whatever it is, and Aaron and I have seen it, so has Jeff. I've seen projects where the burn rate is $1 million a month. And lo and behold, and this happened to me on a project in Syracuse, New York, back in 2008. During that turn down, and the investor lost its appetite. It was a foreign investor, and they pulled out. Contractor was going at $1 million a month before they could stop. They were almost $2.5 million into it. The good news was that they had a lot of these things in place. We immediately liened the project. Ultimately, in that case, discovered that the lenders had defects in their security instruments, and the contractor ended up owning that particular facility. So there are things you can do, but it starts with being aggressive and being proactive. Evaluate and understand your project suspension rights. I guarantee you, most of your contracts, if they're AIA contracts, all of your contracts give you the right to suspend. You haven't been paid. If the project has been stalled, look at and evaluate those rights and what your rights are with respect to compensation. Review your rights with respect to termination for convenience. What we're seeing a lot of now is owners really considering, hey, we're not sure where we're going. We're going to terminate this project for convenience right now and see where we are. That's fine. Most contracts now have those rights. But what are your rights for compensation? What are your obligations with respect to mitigation? Okay? If you think a contract is going to be terminated for convenience, or it is terminated, you have an obligation to mitigate, right? If you could cancel an order for supplies, if you can cancel that, you have an obligation to do that. If you can't send that back, if you can't return it, what are your options with respect to that? Same goes downstream. If I'm talking about upstream, you've got contractors and material suppliers downstream. What are my obligations downstream? Hopefully you did your homework in advance and those obligations match what your prime contract or your upstream contract says, and you have the ability to just essentially in turn pass that notice through to your subcontractor and say, hey, I need you to mitigate immediately. But the most important thing there is to be ready for it, to evaluate it, and be prepared and preempt where you can to avoid potential losses because I didn't cancel an order and I should have, or I didn't pull off as quickly or demobilize as quickly as I should have. I wasn't prepared for it. Aaron, you can go to the next slide. Okay, my last slide, well, I have one after this, but my last main slide here, effective claim management. What happens, one of the questions that we're getting constantly from clients is what happens and what's my liability if one of my laborers, if one of my employees, even in the home office or in the trailer, comes down with COVID-19? What is my potential liability for that? And, you know, unfortunately, this in some part falls in the, you know, category of nobody's exactly sure yet how that's going to play out. It's very likely going to depend on jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But what you can do, again, what's in your control is to document and enforce the fact that you are taking all appropriate and required safety measures. Not just do it, but document it. Show that you've got, you know, the requirements and that you're enforcing the requirements to socially distance. You know, show where there's any question with respect to, you know, can you socially distance on a project, that you can, and that you've looked at it and respond to those concerns and document those concerns so you're on record and you're clear. Make sure that you're complying not only with the local and the state requirements with respect to safety, but the CDC requirements. If somebody does become infected, you have an obligation to send them off the site, obviously, quarantine them for 15 days, they're out. Contract trace where they've been and who they've come in compliance with. Make sure those people are notified and that they are also quarantined and off the project. Make sure that you can show and document full compliance, not only for liability purposes, but for good practical business purposes, right? And these are, again, practices that I know our labor and employment lawyers will tell you time and time again are the kind of practices you should always have. Stay focused on safety. This is no different. It's enhanced. It's different with respect to some of the requirements, but at the end of the day, the goal is the same. Keep your labor force safe. Show that you're doing everything in your ability to keep them safe and complying with all the requirements. That is your best bet. Should a problem develop and should you ultimately find yourself in a situation where you do have either a hot spot on a project or just an infected worker. And then my last slide is make sure that you're going to your, I put up an example of Ohio's, but every Department of Health in every state, at least that we've been in, has this kind of a guideline. Make sure that you're looking for it. These things change daily. For those of you that are in Ohio, you know that we literally had things changing hour to hour. Governor DeWine came out and initially said a week or so ago, everybody's got to wear masks. Realized that wasn't practical, and literally within hours came back and said, okay, it's recommended, it's not mandated. So things are changing regularly. You should have somebody in charge of checking these websites daily in the states where your projects are, making sure that you're in compliance. Where there are changes, documenting that, and making sure that those changes are then implemented immediately on the job site so you can show, again, that you've done everything you could do in today's environment to keep your laborers and your workforce safe. That's the objective. And Aaron, you can move to the next slide. So I've talked about this, and with this, I'm going to turn it over to Aaron and Jeff. Chad is not going to be on. Chad is one of our other, as I mentioned earlier, one of Jeff's colleagues in our construction services group. But Aaron and Jeff are going to take it from here and handle the rest of the presentation. Again, please feel free to interrupt, particularly now that I'm done with my piece. Interrupt Aaron and Jeff all you want. They love it. They want to hear the questions. And we're certainly willing after this to talk to you at any point in time. And please take us up on sending and getting a copy of our COVID-19 checklist. We think you'll find it very useful. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Aaron, and thank you, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you, Rob. Thank you to Source One for having us today. You know, I've seen some of the names on the list, and I know there's a variety of contractors on here, so I will try to keep my presentation broad. Aaron, if you want to jump probably 2 slides ahead. When you think about what's going on, we have to start at the top. So on the one hand, contractors are incurring costs to have all of this PPE on site, and perhaps contractors are incurring costs to work in a way that's not as efficient as it used to be. And owners know that these things are coming. Owners know that these claims are coming, although I think we're at a point now where 45 days ago, we thought the claims may be higher than they are, and we found a way to work around it, or owners are permitting additional time, although they're fighting the time and money claim. So how do we get around some of these things? What sort of provisions in our contract that deal with us? The first one you may have heard of is a force majeure provision, sometimes called an act of God provision. Those have to be read very carefully. Those are explicit provisions. Sometimes they talk about pandemic. Sometimes they talk about epidemic. I didn't know the difference till about 2 weeks ago. One is national, one's worldwide. Some states imply a force majeure provision in there, so that if you're unable to perform because you got a crew that ballooned with this disease and they can't work, that you can argue force majeure. Sometimes you have a lower tier making that argument. We also have 2 legal doctrines, which I'll talk about: impossibility of performance and impracticability of performance. Now, the other thing that we're seeing sometimes are people exploiting this as an excuse because they weren't going to get the work done anyway. So we have to watch for that. Now, why are owners resisting time and money claims? Well, because it costs them time and money. And the last thing they want to do is delay completion of the project or pay you. The other thing that we're seeing here are subcontractors who are claiming they can't perform. They're claiming force majeure, they can't perform. 45 days ago, people were scared to perform even with social distancing, even with the masks on. We're seeing some of that as well. I think Turner sent out a safety plan that required, if you're working within 6 feet, that you have a surgical mask on, 2 layers of glove, and a gown, which I don't even think you can get today. I think hospitals are just have that material. So what if they refuse to work? What if people working within 6 feet of each other, or pardon me, farther than 6 feet of each other, refuse to work because they're saying they don't think it's safe? And that's the question I've been asking, at least in Ohio, is are you smarter than Dr. Acton, right? If Amy Acton says you can work within 6 feet, or excuse me, you can work within 6 feet with masks on or farther than 6 feet, and that will generally mitigate some of the risk. If you refuse to work, is that really a force majeure event, or are you just being hypersensitive? On Better Call Saul, for those of you who've seen the TV show, there's a character who refuses to go outside because he's scared of electromagnetic frequencies, and he wears a funny blanket. Is that a mental sickness or is it a physical sickness, and does that excuse performance? Arguably not. Let's jump to the next slide. So what are the things that have impacted our cost on project work? First of all, social distancing, right? You have slower crews, perhaps a loss of efficiency when people are working. If they have to constantly wash their hands, a loss of efficiency, sanitizing, cleaning, a loss of efficiency. And I know because I've talked to some of you on the phone here, because I have a list, and I ask you, are people wearing masks in the office? And you say, some of you said back to me, yes, people have masks. Are they wearing masks? And so I know, depending on where you fit into our society, or on sadly on some level what your political views are, it's dictating whether or not you're wearing or not wearing a mask. But let me just suggest to you, because I just finished a conversation before I got on this call, that those of you who are permitting the non-wearing of masks, and especially when people may be closer than 6 feet, are just waiting for the plaintiff lawyers of the world to come and, as Tim Minton used to say, make you pay. Where's my camera? Make you pay because you didn't require the PPE that's been suggested by Dr. Acton. And I go back to the prior slide. Don't go back there, and that says, are you smarter than Amy Acton? If Amy says this is what you ought to do, you ought to do it. But all these things have costs, the sanitizing, the hand washing, that PPE. Who's got to pay those additional costs? What if you have a crew absent, not just from sickness or quarantine, but because they have nobody to look after their children? They cannot reasonably find anyone to babysit their kids. Is that performance excused? All of these things are fact-intensive inquiries. On the one hand, if you are getting the claim, if you're the general and you're getting the claim from the sub, you want to fight it. On the other hand, if you're the general, you want to push the claim up to the owner, ask for all those things. So who owns all of that risk is always the question. Aaron, you want to jump slides? That question is always going to be dictated by the contract. The other question is, who has money to pay? So on public projects, what are we seeing? We're seeing that the government obviously gets to decide. Now, you think on a public project to be even easier than a private because the money's not actually coming out of the public owner's pocket the way it does on a private project, where dollar for dollar everything the private owner spends comes out of the profit they make. The problem is on the public side is governments now have less money. We know the state has cut revenues to its school districts and its hospitals and its cities dramatically. So Rob and I were negotiating, and we found a huge lack of project contingency funds as an issue on a recent project. They said, we just can't afford to raise the cost of this project. We have reduced revenues. We're not even sure how we can pay the cost. Now, those of you who do public projects in Ohio know at the front end of the project, you get a finance officer to sign the contract to confirm that the money is there to pay you or subject to collection. And by doing that, you guarantee money is there and you get paid. If that is not there, you risk a claim for void contract. If that's not on your contract, the public owner can say, hey, your contract's void. We don't have to pay you for anything, so watch that. So that, again, on a public level, the issue is revenue cuts. Let's jump to the next one, the private level. And this I'm seeing really take a big hit. And I think there's a lot more uncertainty on the public level. If anything, and I know a couple of you on here do a lot of big, heavy highway work, I think if we do hit a recession, that governments will start spending once again big time on the public level, the same way they did during the Great Recession. But what about the private level? What about me? Everybody you see on this call, I get, with the exception of Jeff and I guess Rob, you can see Jeff's in his office at Public Square, but I'm at home. I haven't been in my office in 70 plus days, as I bet a lot of you on this call are as well. So what will our office needs look like? What will Han Loser do or Source One do for their office needs when our lease comes up? Are we going to keep everybody or are we going to let some people work from home? So offices are shrinking. What about takeout food? People aren't going to restaurants as much and many won't survive. I never bought anything on Amazon, but now I'm buying everything on Amazon. So all of our real estate needs are going to be changing dramatically. And that makes all of the current projects a little bit riskier. So what's the impact of that? Now you're asking for more money. So on a private project, it means everybody takes a loss. So what's at the lender level? Because most people aren't self-funding these projects. At the lender level, the lender is being delayed in getting their money back. They're lending it out. Maybe it's interest only, but there's a delay in them getting repaid. And that's a greater risk of default. If you're building a shopping center for restaurants, which are now going out of business, or for an expanded Macy's, or JCPenney, which filed bankruptcy, or J. Crew, which just filed bankruptcy, those tenants aren't coming. So now will a lender say, hey, this project's no longer in balance? On a project, you generally have to have a certain balance between equity and debt. You have to have 20% equity on some project. And if suddenly the value drops, will the lender put their hand out to the borrower and say, you got to pay me? You've got to put money in the project. In that instance, some of those borrowers are single asset entities without a personal guarantee, and they say, buy jingle mail once again. Here, Mr. Lender, you can have the project back. The contractors don't get paid. Liens get put on there, and that's another presentation for another day, but that's an issue. What about owners for the projects you keep going? Well, they're getting a delayed completion, and that impacts their tenants and when their tenants have to start paying rent. Plus, if they have a loan, they've got to pay interest on that. Future tenants, the people waiting to get in the building, they have delayed access. They've got lost sales. And if they're somewhere else, they've got to pay extended current rent. So all these things seem to hurt things. A general contractor, you all have additional costs to perform. You may have extended performance time, slowed performance if you're not working as efficiently. Who's going to pay for that? Same for subs. And I've suggested this no less than 15 times on a variety of seminars I've given over the last however many days. Right now, it's every man for himself. I'm incurring these costs. I'm sending them upstream or I'm pushing them down on my subcontractors. I shouldn't have to pay this cost. But what I also hear from you all is you're willing to commit to a fair compromise. everyone's willing to pay their share of this if they know everybody else is taking the pain. So is there a fair compromise? Is there a Corona compromise? When will industry groups get together and come up with, here is the fair compromise. Here's how cost should be allocated. Here's how pain should be allocated. Here's how time should be allocated. And in doing so, everybody knows, okay, I'm doing my part for society. They're doing their part, and everybody's sharing the pain. Sometimes that makes it easier. Let's jump to the next slide. And I have limited time because I want to make sure, Jeff, I don't cut into him. Impossibility of performance arises after you've entered in the contract, but now something happens and you can't perform. So, for example, in Pennsylvania, you had a contract to build a office building. Along comes the Pennsylvania government and says, stop. All construction stopped in Pennsylvania initially with the exception of hospital construction. So that would be impossibility of performance. In Ohio, if you had a crew where the virus bloomed and suddenly everybody was ill, that could be impossibility of performance. Let's jump to the next slide. An even bigger word, impracticability of performance. This means it's impractical to perform because the risk involved outweighs the ends attained by performance. And so here, if you jump down about the third to last slide, a party is expected to do reasonable efforts to surmount the performance. And performance is only impractical if it's impractical in spite of such efforts. So if we were to find out that masks and social distancing were not effective, I think we're still early in this to know what is effective. My wife is telling to me today, sunshine appears to slow down the virus as well. So let's all get outside. I know that as my religious community opens up, one of the compromises has been we can do religious services outside, but not inside because inside's too dangerous. So are there reasonable efforts you can do to overcome that? And if not, then impracticability of performance would excuse it. Okay, let's jump to the next one. Now, I'm putting these little puzzle pieces out there, and I'll tie it all together for you, at least in the end of my part. So again, impossibility of performance can even impact work on government projects. I know a lot of you do government projects, but careful, there's a line of decisions at the state that when it places the risk of governmental interference on the party who contracted to render the performance. So here, what does that mean? It means that if Amy Acton says, you've got to do all of these things, and you say, I want to push that cost up, and the contract said you have the duty to obey all laws as amended, arguably that upper tier government owner, so for example, ODOT's going to argue you always had that risk to try to get out of it. Okay, next slide. So what are the contract provisions that impact us? Rob talked about some. Force majeure. Under a classic force majeure, you get time but no money. Because a classic force majeure is an act of God. Nobody caused it. It's not something the upper tier caused at all, so why should they have to pay for it? What we've been arguing for people is that when Amy Acton says you have to do certain things, it's not the force majeure that's required, and it's Amy Acton that's required. We're making those arguments to try to get paid. Suspension of performance. At the beginning of this, contractors were playing chicken with owners to see, are we going to argue force majeure to get out of it, or will the owner argue suspension of performance? Suspension of performance is often compensable. You get both time and money. So that's why contractors wanted to see a suspension. Even if you only have force majeure, and even if it's just a short delay and you're not asking for more costs, you must give notice. Otherwise, you'll get to the end of the project and suddenly the owner say, hey, I'm assessing you X weeks of liquidated damage. You'll say, what are you talking about? My guys were sick. They had COVID. You can't assess me LDs. They'll point to the contract. The contract said you had to give notice within X days. You failed to do that. Therefore, you own the risk. You've got to pay LDs. So you want to be careful. You always want to document. Next slide, Aaron. And that's what this slide talks about. Why do contracts have provisions in there that make it hard to document? Well, the owner wants to make it hard to preserve and perfect claims. They want you to have to really go about it, not just say, hey, we had a conversation, you knew. No, contract requires you to put it in writing. Why does the owner also want it? Because if you talk to me in the field, you know, this might be a problem over here, and you say, yeah, we'll take a look at it, and I forget, what am I going to do about it? If you send me a letter, I am now forced to deal with something promptly and timely. The other thing is I want to avoid getting to the end of the project and have you drop a stack of notices or tickets on my desk and tell me that now I owe you the money. If you would have told me in real time, I would have had the ability to investigate. Waiting until the end robs me of that. So let's jump to a slide. So let's talk about when you have to send notice of a claim. And that's just not for COVID, for any of this. Any time that you want an equitable adjustment of contract time or sum. So if you want more time and more money for the work, you got to ask for a change order. Now, the question is, just starting the work without a change order or constructive change directive waive your right? Let's make sure we know what a change order versus CCD. Change order is an agreement between you and me about the scope and cost. I sign it, you sign it, amends the contract. CCD, constructive change directive, means I'm telling you I recognize this extra work. We don't agree on cost, but I'm signing this, get going. Many contracts, especially public projects, say if you start work without a change order CCD, you've waived your rights. Bye-bye claim. We don't even get to have a hearing on whether it's compensable or not. The hearing's going to be, did you send the letter? And for those of you who are project managers, you don't want to be walking into the owner's office and find out you don't get to ask for money because you didn't send a letter. That's not a great way to keep your job. So if you're directed to do something that you don't want to do or think you're entitled to a change order, under protest, look at the bottom of this slide. This is when you're going to want to take a screenshot of. If directed or threatened that you'll be in breach, for example, if there's a scope dispute, you say, I'm entitled to more money. And they say, no, this is base contract work. So you send a letter. Those of you who've dealt with Andy, Rob, or I for a long time have seen us draft this letter several times. You've directed us to proceed. We're doing so under protest. We reserve our right. We're going to track our costs and time and submit to you for reimbursement. What does that do? It makes sure that if you don't have a change order, constructive change directive, at least you have an argument about why you're entitled to one. Okay, next slide. But what if you can't? Be aware here that if there's an engineer involved, or if the repair requires you to design something and you don't have any design responsibility, well, then you ought not be moving forward, and you document the fact that I can't move forward, I don't have a revised design, and now I'm entitled to additional delay. Let's jump. Next slide, please. So what type of delays are there? The first type of delay is an excusable delay. An excusable delay means it's not my fault, I might be entitled to time and money. And so you want to be able to have excusable delays whenever possible. The bottom of the slide says a non-excusable delay. So if your subcontractor doesn't show up and doesn't work and it delays your work, that's a non-excusable delay for you, or at least it was. If the reason the subcontractor can't show up is because its whole crew is sick and you need that sub and can't find somebody else, you're going to argue force majeure, jump to the top of the slide that it's an excusable delay and you're entitled to time. There's a middle, and money. There's that middle category of excusable, non-compensable. Again, third-party causes nobody control, acts of God, weather, what we call force majeure. And once again, you still need to give notice of that to avoid getting hit with LDs. Next slide. Let's jump a couple slides. One more. So I want to pull some of this. So one more even, Aaron. I want to make sure I don't cut off Jeff's time. So what do you have to do? What do you have to think about? First, you want to follow the contract when giving notice. When do you give notice? When the initial delay happens. I would say you update it weekly to your owner. Here's the additional costs we're incurring, and that will put pressure on them as well to deal with it. And when you're done, sometimes till you're done, you can't figure out what the impact was to your schedule. You give all of those notices. So let's jump to the next two slides ahead, please. Prosecution of a claim. One more. There you go. On a public claim, you've got to follow whatever the administrative process is. For those of you who do ODOT work, you know, step 1, step 2, step 3, and you know, many public owners have adopted the same thing. On a private project, if you have an AIA provision or AIA contract, you may have to go through mediation followed by arbitration and litigation. So how are you successful in all of this? Well, first is to talk to somebody who can help you put some of these puzzle pieces together. But you want your claim theme and theory to align with what's permitted under the contract. So if the contract says you don't get consequential damages or you don't get certain categories of damages, well, then let's not spend our time arguing about something you're never going to get anyways. Second, make sure you understand the difference between force majeure and suspension and direction from others. Third, have a clear defensible measurement. So this is the important thing. Those of you who say, well, I think I spent 4 hours a week for the last 4 weeks and I want to get reimbursed for that. That's not going to do any good. Be like a lawyer. At the beginning of a phone call with me, I write down what time we start. And when I'm done doing the work, I write down what time I end. I have a daily report. I could go back at any point for the last X number of years and try to figure out when I started and stopped. If you want to be able to track additional costs, you need that level of detail. Jeff's going to walk you through the type of overall detail you're going to want to figure out crew inefficiencies. You want to also demonstrate efforts to mitigate cost and delay. So, for example, if you have to hire a replacement subcontractor, make sure you've got multiple bids from multiple subcontractors show you try to get the best and cheapest replacement. And then finally, if you're not getting paid on these things, we can always talk about a lien and bond claim. I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Roush, who's going to talk to you all about how we calculate and track some of this. But I remain here as well, and I'm listening, so if you have questions, just as Rob says.
Good afternoon, everybody. As Aaron said, it is a puzzle piece. You got the contract, and what does the contract say and require? You got the notice. You got a notice because something's happened, and delays and impacts and issues happen on projects. And then once you get to that point, what's it costing me? What's it costing the company? What's it costing the project? So that's the fourth step. The most important step is the third step, is how to document. The depth, the degree, the frequency, and the range of the documentation will help determine the cost in which you want to recover as damages. So as we're talking today, and as the next couple of slides go through, I'm glad to share guiding steps and best practice tips, because I've been on the jobs, both as project manager, senior company management, program management, and there's just basic things, as Rob said, not just because with COVID, because COVID is something we've not encountered before. And part of the COVID claim scenario is how to apportion that out, and that was mentioned before. But ultimately, the whole sequence of COVID issue and the impact is about raising the bar, enhancing what is being documented. So that's the critical aspect here. So let me come back here. A couple of the main points on this particular slide. There's documentation in place on the project that you want to have your project team, your frontline superintendent, the project manager, senior management know a couple basic things about the existing documentation. What does our game plan, what does our schedule say? What does it show how the project was going to be prosecuted? By knowing what the schedule says and reflects, it gives you that tool to better identify the problems, take the necessary action, and then get that documentation program in place. Same goes with the cost. What were the budgeted costs? What were our actual costs? What are our production rates? And how's everything looking? Knowing the dollars is essential, because you're going to have the opportunity to see variances and overruns quicker. The documentation program gets triggered right away. Yes, it gets triggered for the whole project, but when these issues come up, that's when it really kicks in. Before, during, after, and down the road of an impact, including the COVID situation. When these situations, these impacts might be anticipated, you may have a hunch. You may have a hunch that something's coming up, or I don't like the way the project's progressing right now because of the COVID holdups, and we'll talk about some of the efficiency side, or there's an actual impact on the job. And your record keeping, I certainly encourage and have learned over the years and over the projects, a regimented record keeping in real time is important. And growing up through the ranks on projects, certainly your job cost system is one of the most important ones. I suggest that you create tailored and custom cost codes for the impacts that you might be experiencing on jobs. The last item here I want to mention is that still, construction is it's a team undertaking. It takes collaboration. It takes working together, as everybody knows. And when things break down, you still have to try to mitigate the impact. And you as the constructor, the construction manager, subcontractor, supplier, you're the one that's feeling the impact. So communicate to everybody that impact is very real to you, very real to the project. Make them aware, document to improve their awareness, and then that puts you in a better position to improve a successful recovery of time and money and a successful project outcome, both in completion and on the economic side. So Aaron, if you could go to the next slide. So as I said, we've got to get to the point where what's the value of the claim, both in time and cost. So go through here. The cause and effect of a COVID-19 item, there's going to be schedule delays, hindrances, interferences, impacts. But the next item there is the unexpected project factors. And these are the things that are happening right now. They're not, unexpected is very different than differing. It's different than unforeseen. It's different from a change condition. The unexpected project factors come back to the health and safety protocols, lost time because of those protocols, and there's certainly a direct, and there's a trackable and a pursuable cost figure with that. Also on the direct cost, whether it's labor, material, equipment, your subcontractors, and the indirect costs of your project team, general conditions in home office. But there are distinct differences, and every different cost should be pursued and should be documented. Lost time, the labor inefficiencies, and other actual costs, additional tools, equipment, general conditions, maybe additional scaffolding or access, that type of, the project has to be resequenced. There are distinct costs that come with that. So we go to the next slide. I'm going to go through these items here. When a project is underway and that's being beneficially suspended, we certainly recommend some basic measures be undertaken here. Photograph and video documentation of where is the project at status-wise. Do an inventory of everything on the project, because when the project does resume, you know where it's at and how we're going to schedule and how we're going to sequence and perform that work. The next item I see a lot, I hear about a lot, I know it happens so much, is what does the CA, the construction administration, how is that happening before COVID-19, during or after? Because the turnaround time from an AE, design changes, change orders, RFI responses, shop drawings, pay applications, that itself, outside of COVID, but even with the COVID, can become more of an issue if the AE is not covering the projects and coming out to the job site as much and working remotely. The last bullet point here, just as far as the disruption to the work of COVID, the most uncertain, but probably the most certain cost that's going to happen will be what's happening to your labor from a productivity and efficiency standpoint because of COVID. So if we can go to the next slide, Aaron. A couple of types of delays to be tracking here would be procurement delays. Procurement drives construction. And since that being the case, we need to be able to identify and document these issues. Identify needs to be early, and document needs to be thoroughly, timely, and consistently of either a procurement or a construction delay. And I would always, in the letter, as well as the very succinct phrasing that Aaron mentioned earlier, but also encouraging, going back again, encourage an explanation of what was the impact, and explain it to all the parties, owners, architects, and owner's rep, especially owner's reps, whether developers involved, banks, or other agencies. So we go to the next slide we talk about cost tracking measures. And cost tracking measure starts with the documentation. So that documentation here is when a project is officially suspended, we pulled some bullet points together here. Man hours and manpower. What were the man hours that were being expended to if the project shut down to secure the site? Itemize that in the daily report. Also, keep a spreadsheet. We like to see contractors and parties involved on keeping spreadsheets or logs of those costs to shut down and secure a project. What was the head count at the time of the suspension? The head count's not going to jump right back and start at that number again. So we want to see what's the time frame it takes to get back to your pre-suspension workforce level. Demobilization. What material, what equipment, what manpower is coming off the site? Document that thoroughly. Follow some of these points that are on this particular slide. These slides will be available to you. Also, the last one there, public safety on a heavy highway project, maintenance of traffic. There's closures that you had to go through the process of getting a permit. Want to make sure that those ongoing costs through the suspension are documented. Next slide, please. Here we get into some of the real other costs other than demobilization. When the work resumes, it's another cost category. What's the remobilization cost to come back on site, bring equipment back, remobilize and stuff. But here we have both the idle side of manpower and equipment. And you can follow the bullets there, documenting the workers that were idle because of the suspension, but also where was the work at? Well, what was the status of the work and what tasks were they working on? And the same with the equipment. Is some equipment able to be put to another site, brought out to another site and put to use and continue on in an unimpacted job? And just, that's all just a way to use project staff, project engineers, superintendents, and foremen to record that. And a big record, or a good record tool is the critical path schedule. Use the schedule updates to document the impact due to COVID-related delays. On escalation on the next page, on the next slide, please. We've got both an escalation, a higher cost on the material side and the labor side. There's times when, with COVID and other project delays, that sometimes the major procurement deliverables are going to cost more from what you originally bid and what's in your contract. The market pricing for typical commodity building materials are going to go up. Track that to show here's the cost impact because at the material side, and labor getting put into a different wage rate, track the wage differential for the higher wages. Next slide, please. Is really, as I said, we could spend hours and days, and there are loss of productivity impacts when we got COVID because, one, the project, we had a pre-pandemic production rate, our proven productivity. Our proven productivity in terms of the industry terminology, that's the measured mile. So want to be able to document and calculate, here's what my proven productivity was before a COVID-19 matter came up. And then when the project restarted, my production rate certainly wasn't where I was when the issue came up, and it takes quite a long time to get back on track to that proven productivity. So using your job cost system on man hours and cost, I'd be glad to talk to anybody about implementing and instituting the tracking techniques to do that. But you watch for your productivity impact to your labor. We can go to 2 more slides, please. Right there, thank you. So when a project is suspended and does resume, there's going to be a second learning curve, maybe even another additional learning curve, depending if everybody's coming back at one time or if it's going to be phased in. That productivity impact on a restart needs to be tracked as well. And you just can't pick up where project left off. And again, I'd recommend creating additional job codes for this. Then go to 2 more slides to the unexpected project factors. So, back in March, April, and May, and it's going to be different in June. But there are the social distancing requirements, protocols. The health and safety now, initially it was just 6 foot and hand washing. Now it's going to be masks and whatever else the state and the CDC puts out there. But there's through a job tracker, you can establish and record discrete lost time. What do they what's the crew losing? What are the workers losing in lost productivity and progress? To have to stay 6 foot apart, you have to resequence and move the crews around. And the same is coming through the gate every day on the project. How much time is lost getting temperatures taken? Suiting up with whatever PPE is required on the project. That is 100% lost time. That lost time does not get counted into your loss of productivity. So there's a distinct difference between the pure lost time and then lost productivity. If we go to the next slide, there's some tips here on encourage a workday tracker to record how much time is spent by the workforce, by either the foreman, the superintendent, or project engineer. How much time is spent going through and fulfilling and abiding by the COVID-19 safety and health measures. There is a direct cost of having the PPE products there, hand sanitizer on the site, hand sanitizer stations. Maybe you're having maybe more than one or two, or what your original pre-COVID sanitation service costs are and such. But those are all trackable off the job site, and get them into the hands of someone who is keeping a file and able to pull this together so that the cost damages can be computed. If you can go to the last two slides here, both on the additional direct cost and indirect cost. So one of the best means to document here to get to a number is using the daily report to know what work is progressing, what's not able to be progressed, what's on hold, is the head count for the subcontractors down because of COVID? Am I having to do a lot of rotation changes and resequencing? Use that daily report. That's going to be a pivotal document to help demonstrate the cause and the effect and such. And the other one here is on a company level, is that job cost system. Whether it's you have a spreadsheet or you have a software program, or you've created a custom one, I strongly encourage the COVID-19 cost codes. Very easy to extract out, and it comes back to who's got the best substantiation prevails. And we want the parties who are at risk, we want the parties who are exposed to the cost impact to have the best documentation. That's you. Follow some of the tips here, best practices, and that'll help on your direct cost. And then the last slide I have is on the additional indirect cost. And that people may disagree that superintendents and project managers are indirect costs, because they're the ones they're the frontline folks. But keep a track of what time is the superintendent spending administering and overseeing work in a COVID environment versus beforehand. And there is a lot of lost time. I tour projects, and I talk to supers who are out taking temperatures, and they're amped up. They ramped up their number of job walkthroughs, seeing what's happening. The same thing with the project managers. So I would like to offer our assistance to get real situations, questions and answers. Aaron and I'd be glad to go into that particular portion right now. With that, Aaron, you want to take it then?
Yeah, I know Aaron Hawk at one point tried to unmute everybody, but that didn't work, or we weren't able to do that. So if you have questions, maybe you just throw them into the chat, and we'll be happy to answer them. The other thing we can do is we recorded this, and we're happy to provide you with the recording or the slides if you need them as well. If anybody has questions, maybe just type them right into the chat right now, and I'll read them, and we can try to answer them. And if not, then we thank everybody. I know we went 5 minutes extra. We want to thank Suhas. We want to thank Source One, for having us today and participating with us today. If any of you have any other questions, I know all of our emails are up there and our phone numbers, and we're happy to speak or email with any of you at any time. Thank you, and thank you also to Aaron Hawk for coordinating and running all this for us. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Stay safe and stay healthy.